What does a man gain when he resists the world, yet loses everything he loves? And what if, in that loss, he discovers a truth that outlives him forever? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's Figures story, we travel into the windswept deserts of North Africa to meet a man whose name still stirs courage in hearts nearly a century later. His story is not of comfort or wealth, but of choices. Choices so costly that most of us would tremble at the thought of them. And yet, from those choices came a lesson about God, about dignity, and about the weight of a single soul standing firm when the world collapses around it. Tonight, we tell the story of Omar al Mukhtar, the lion of the desert. The desert is a cruel teacher. It strips life down to its barest truths: thirst, hunger, and the endless mirage between survival and surrender. Omar was born in 1858 in a small village called Zawiyat Janzur in eastern Libya. His family was poor, but like many in the Sanusi order, a religious movement rooted in Qur'an, faith, and resilience, they believed that strength lay not in what you owned, but in how you carried God in your heart. As a child, Omar memorized the Qur'an by heart. He wasn't just a reciter, he lived by its words. Teachers noted his quiet seriousness, his humility, and his sharp mind. Yet even as he grew in faith, he also grew in hardship. His father died when Omar was still young. That absence shaped him deeply. Without a father's hand to guide him, Omar leaned into God's hand more fully. But was that dependence enough to prepare him for the storms ahead? He did not know then, but God was already 3 steps ahead. By his late teens, Omar was drawn into the Sanusi order's circles of learning. They weren't just teaching religion, they were teaching discipline, leadership, and resistance against injustice. Omar became a teacher himself, guiding children in Qur'an schools, tending goats to feed himself, and living a life of simplicity. He could have remained that way, a village imam, a shepherd of both sheep and souls. But life rarely leaves God's chosen untouched. A greater test was stirring beyond the horizon. In 1911, Italy invaded Libya. The desert that had been Omar's teacher now became his battlefield. Villages were burned, families displaced, mosques desecrated. Many elders counseled surrender. After all, who could fight a modern army with cannons, airplanes, and endless resources? Omar was over 50 years old at the time. By all measures, he was past the age of war. He could have stayed behind, watching silently as younger men bled. But Omar made a choice, and it was the choice that would define his life, his people, and his place in history. He lifted his Qur'an in one hand and his rifle in the other, declaring that submission belonged to God alone, not to men. His decision was not simply military, it was spiritual. "We do not fight to win," he told his companions. "We fight because God commands us to stand against injustice." Think about that for a moment. Would you take up arms knowing you had little chance of earthly victory? Or would you step aside and save yourself? Which path truly honors faith? At first, the desert seemed to favor him. His men, no more than a few hundred at a time, struck with precision. They knew the land, the caves, the wadis. They hit caravans and outposts, disappeared into sandstorms, and re-emerged like whispers of judgment. Omar became more than a man. He became a shadow, a rumor, a nightmare that haunted Italian camps at night. But victories came at a price. Each time his men struck, the Italians struck back harder. Whole tribes were punished. Families were dragged into concentration camps. Starvation and disease spread. Omar's choice to resist was costing his people dearly. And here lies the heart of his first great dilemma. Was it righteous to continue resistance if it brought more suffering upon his people? Or was surrender, though humiliating, the merciful path? Omar prayed in the silence of the desert nights, torn between 2 impossible roads, but he kept returning to one truth: suffering with dignity is greater than living in chains. Still, in the quiet of those nights, as the stars glistened over the Libyan desert, one question must have pressed against his heart. Would his people remember him as their protector, or as the reason their lives were torn apart? And so, the story of Omar al Mukhtar begins not with easy answers, but with a choice that shook the fate of a nation. A choice to resist when surrender was simpler. A choice to stand when falling would have been easier. But what he did not yet know was that this choice would lead to betrayals, losses, and sacrifices beyond what even his iron will could imagine. Because while Omar could outsmart armies in the desert, there were enemies creeping closer. Not with rifles, but with broken promises, whispered lies, and betrayals that would cut deeper than any blade. And one of those betrayals was already in motion. The desert remembers footsteps. Every rider, every caravan, every soldier leaves behind traces that only the sharpest eyes can read. Omar al Mukhtar had those eyes. By the time the Italians poured deeper into Libya, he had already mastered the art of turning the land itself into a weapon. But he was not a young man. His beard had turned gray, his back bore the weight of years, and yet he carried himself with the energy of someone half his age. Why? Because for Omar, resistance was not about flesh or strength, it was about spirit. And the spirit, when held by God, does not grow old. By 1923, Omar was recognized as the leader of the resistance in Cyrenaica. His forces rarely numbered more than a few hundred at a time. They had no tanks, no airplanes, no modern communication. What they did have was faith, knowledge of the land, and a leader who understood that war was not only about weapons, but about hearts. He trained his men in patience and discipline. Before every battle, he gathered them in prayer. He reminded them, victory is not written in numbers. Victory belongs to the one whose heart does not bend before men. Imagine that, leading young men into battle, knowing many would not return, yet asking them to see death not as defeat, but as martyrdom, as passage into God's promise. Would you have had the courage to follow him into such fire? The Italians began to fear him, but also to study him. They called him the fox of the desert. He struck swiftly, disappeared, and always seemed to know their movements before they made them. Omar had an uncanny ability to read terrain, anticipate ambushes, and slip through nets designed to catch him. But his brilliance wasn't just in tactics, it was in mercy. On more than one occasion, his men captured Italian soldiers. Some clamored to kill them, to repay blood with blood. But Omar would step forward and say, "We do not kill prisoners. Our fight is not with their souls, but with the injustice they serve." Those decisions bewildered his men and terrified his enemies. Who was this man? Who could strike with such ferocity one moment, yet spare lives the next? Was he not weakening his cause by showing mercy? Or was he revealing a truth deeper than war itself? That true power is never cruelty, but restraint. But the mercy that lifted his name also drew consequences. The Italians, humiliated by defeats and defiance, escalated their campaign. Villages were destroyed. Families were rounded into camps, where starvation and disease became daily companions. Thousands perished behind barbed wire, while Omar and his fighters wandered the desert, unable to protect everyone. At night, Omar would sit in the sand, his Qur'an resting in his lap, and whisper prayers under the desert stars. Did he question himself then? Did he wonder if his resistance was costing too much? Perhaps, but he always returned to one truth. Submission belongs to God, not to tyrants. Still, resistance was more than prayer and patience. It was survival. Food ran scarce, ammunition scarcer. Some fighters deserted, broken by hunger or tempted by Italian promises of money and safety. Betrayal seeped through the cracks of loyalty. Omar faced one of his greatest dilemmas then. How to lead men who were as human as they were brave. Some grew weary of endless fighting. Some asked him, "Sheikh Omar, are we not prolonging our people's suffering? Would it not be wiser to lay down arms?" His reply was quiet, yet it cut through their doubts like a blade. "If we bow to injustice today, We leave our children in chains tomorrow. Better that we suffer now than they suffer forever. But was that truly wisdom, or a burden too heavy for his people to carry? In 1927, the Italians sent a message: surrender, and Omar would be given safety, honor, and a comfortable life. He was already nearly 70 years old. He could have accepted. He could have rested, lived his last years in peace. But Omar refused. His answer was simple: I do not trade faith for comfort. My home is where God places me, not where tyrants tempt me. Yet, even as he refused, the cracks in his circle widened. Whispers of betrayal grew louder. Men once loyal began to falter, and Omar, despite his unshakable faith, began to see what every leader fears most. The battle against the enemy outside is easier than the battle against weakness within. Still, the desert carried him forward. Raids continued, ambushes struck, and Italian supply lines bled. But the cost was mounting. For every victory Omar achieved, his people paid tenfold in suffering. And the Italians were preparing something darker, something that no amount of desert cunning could outmaneuver. Because sometimes the deadliest enemy is not the one marching across the sands, but the invisible trap being laid in silence, waiting for the moment when faith collides with fate. And Omar was walking straight into it. The desert has many faces. By day, a furnace of heat that burns the skin. By night, a silence so deep that a whisper feels like thunder. For Omar al Mukhtar, both faces became companions in his long war. But even he could sense that something had shifted. The Italians were no longer simply trying to win battles. They were trying to break a soul. And to crush a man like Omar, they believed they had to crush the people around him. By 1930, a new Italian general, Rodolfo Graziani, arrived with orders to end the resistance once and for all. His strategy was not clever ambushes or grand maneuvers. It was cruelty. Villages were emptied. Hundreds of thousands of Libyans were forced into barbed wire camps in the desert, starved and stripped of dignity. Whole tribes were uprooted from their ancestral homes, their livestock taken, their wells poisoned. The camps became places of death. It is said that nearly half the population of Cyrenaica was forced into them. Mothers clutched their children, fathers watched helplessly as disease spread. The desert, once their home, had been turned into a prison. And Omar knew. Every raid he led now carried a heavier cost, not just for soldiers, but for innocents. Here lay another tormenting dilemma. Should he stop fighting to spare his people the punishment? Or should he continue to keep alive the spirit of resistance? One night, under a cold desert moon, Omar gathered his closest companions. His voice, though old, was steady. They want us to choose between slavery and death. But remember, it is God who gives life and God who takes it. If we surrender, we give what belongs to God into the hands of men. Tell me, which sin is greater? The men listened, torn between fear and faith. And in that moment, Omar's words rekindled their fire. They would fight on, not because victory was certain, but because conscience demanded it. But conscience does not fill empty stomachs, and it does not heal the cries of children behind barbed wire. Omar carried this weight like a stone upon his chest. Did he ever ask himself if his choices were righteous or reckless? Was he leading his people into glory or into ruin? Graziani, meanwhile, studied Omar as one might study a rare beast. He admired his courage, even feared it. But he believed he had found the key: isolation. If Omar could be cut off from supplies, allies, and hiding places, even the lion of the desert would fall. So the Italians built a massive barbed wire barrier, stretching from the Mediterranean coast deep into the desert to block support from Egypt. It was a wall of steel across the sand, meant to trap Omar in his own land. Omar laughed when he first heard of it. "Do they think the desert bows to wire?" he said. And for a while he proved them wrong, slipping past their fences, striking caravans, vanishing into the sands. But the noose was tightening. The desert that once gave him freedom was being caged piece by piece. It was not just the Italians he had to fear. Among his own, desperation bred weakness. Some men began to whisper, perhaps Omar was too old. Perhaps his fight was hopeless. A few defected, handing information to the Italians. And betrayal, that most bitter of poisons, began to seep closer to his heart. Imagine standing in his place, an old man hunted by armies, betrayed by some of your own, watching your people suffer in camps, yet still asked to lead. Would you not feel weary? Would you not wonder if God had abandoned you? But Omar never claimed strength was his own. When asked how he endured, he said only, patience is from God, and patience is victory. Still, even patience has its breaking point. One fateful raid in 1931 ended with Omar's horse stumbling in rocky terrain. His companions tried to shield him, but the Italians closed in. Surrounded, outnumbered, Omar raised his rifle one last time. He fought until the last bullet, until his capture was certain. When the Italians seized him, they expected defiance, perhaps anger. Instead, they found an old man with weary eyes, holding his Qur'an close to his chest, calm as the desert night. "Are you Omar al Mukhtar?" they asked. "I am Omar," he replied, "and I do not surrender." The lion of the desert was finally in chains. But even then, the Italians did not know the trap they had walked into. For a man like Omar, chains could not bind what truly made him dangerous, the moral weight of his story. And as they dragged him toward his trial, his enemies believed they had won. But, in truth, they had only written the opening lines of his eternal legacy. Because sometimes, the greatest victories come not in the battles we win, but in the way we choose to lose. The trial of Omar al Mukhtar was meant to be a spectacle. The Italians wanted not only to capture the man, but to crush the spirit he embodied. They dreamed of a courtroom where the lion of the desert would tremble, plead, perhaps even beg for mercy. A scene they could parade as proof that resistance had been broken. But they did not understand the kind of man they had chained. On September 15th, 1931, Omar was brought before a military tribunal in Benghazi. He was 73 years old. His beard was white, his face marked by years of hardship. Yet his posture was straight, his gaze steady. Even in chains, he looked like the judge, and his captors looked like the accused. Eyewitnesses described the moment he entered the courtroom. The Italian officers stiffened, and even the translators lowered their eyes. There was something about him, a calmness, an authority that did not come from weapons or titles, but from conviction. One officer muttered under his breath, "This is no ordinary prisoner." The charges were read out: leading armed rebellion, resisting authority, refusing surrender. Each accusation was true. Omar did not deny them. When asked to respond, he answered simply, "I fought. I resisted." Because submission belongs to God alone. Think of that. Facing death, offered a chance to save himself by denying his cause. Yet he stood firm. Would you have done the same? Or would the weight of years, the hope of a little more life, have made you falter? The Italians tried another tactic. They reminded him of his age, of the comfort he could have if he cooperated. They painted pictures of peace, of safety. But Omar's reply cut like a blade. "I am not seeking comfort. I am seeking justice. If you believe killing me will end the struggle, then you do not know my people." The room fell silent. Even Graziani himself, listening from afar, later admitted that Omar's dignity unsettled him. This was not a broken man. This was a man who had already surrendered his life to God long before the trial began. The verdict, of course, was predetermined. He was sentenced to death by hanging. But even this sentence carried risk for the Italians. They feared that executing Omar would turn him into a martyr, a flame that could not be extinguished. Some argued to imprison him quietly, to let age and time do their work. Yet others insisted no. The people must see him fall. They must witness his defeat. They must know the lion is gone. But here was the hidden twist. By showing his death, they would not kill the legend. They would engrave it deeper into the soul of his nation. In the days before his execution, Omar was offered comforts, food, rest, even the chance to speak with priests who urged him to abandon his resistance. He declined it all. His Qur'an remained at his side. He prayed calmly, and those who guarded him confessed they had never seen such peace in a condemned man. One Italian officer, shaken by his composure, asked, "Are you not afraid of death?" Omar looked at him and said, "Death is a bridge. It takes us from this life to the next. Why should I fear crossing to where my Lord awaits?" Imagine hearing that from a man about to die by your command. How would it feel? To see the prisoner comfort the jailer? On the morning of September 16th, 1931, thousands were forced to gather near the camp of Solok to witness the execution. Men, women, and children were herded to the site. The Italians wanted them to see Omar broken. Instead, they saw something else. Omar walked to the gallows with steady steps. His hands were chained, but his head was held high. Eyewitnesses recalled that the crowd, though silenced by soldiers, wept openly. Mothers whispered prayers. Men clenched their fists. Children clung to their mothers' robes. As he climbed the platform, he turned his face to the sky. His lips moved in prayer, and at that moment, many believed he was already beyond the reach of his captors, standing not before them, but before God. The noose was placed around his neck. An officer barked the order. The trapdoor opened, and Omar al Mukhtar, the lion of the desert, fell into history. But the silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of something greater. The moment when a man's death becomes larger than his life. Because in killing him, the Italians had not ended the resistance. They had sanctified it. They had turned his struggle into a legacy that would echo long after the dust of that day settled. Was it a loss? Or was it the greatest victory of all? The gallows had done its work, but the desert was not silent. The Italians believed that by hanging Omar al Mukhtar, they had ended not only a man, but a movement. What they failed to understand was this: you can chain a body, but you cannot chain conviction. You can silence a voice, but you cannot silence faith. When Omar's body was lowered, the crowd was forced to watch in terror. Some whispered his name under their breath. Others bit their lips, holding back cries that might bring the lash of a soldier's whip. But deep inside, every witness carried a seed that no prison, no gallows, no empire could uproot. In the days after his execution, Libyan villages were thick with sorrow. Old men told stories of the lion of the desert around fires. Women wept in secret, their tears falling over children who would grow up hearing not only of his death, but of his dignity. Even those who had once doubted him now felt the weight of his sacrifice. And in the Italian camps, soldiers spoke in hushed tones. Some admitted they had never seen a man face death with such calm. A few even confessed that his words haunted them at night. "Death is a bridge. Why should I fear crossing to where my Lord awaits?" Omar was gone in flesh, but in spirit he had multiplied. Here lies the irony of history. Empires often believe that fear will secure their victory. Yet fear is a poor jailer. It does not breed obedience, it breeds resistance. The Italians had tried to humiliate Omar publicly. Instead, they had crowned him in the eyes of his people. His death became a torch, carried by others, a whisper of courage that flowed through generations. And wasn't that the hand of God? That what men intended as an end became the true beginning. Years passed. The desert continued to hold its secrets. The war dragged on, but the memory of Omar never dimmed. Even in defeat, Libyans carried his story as proof that honor was greater than chains. Children who had seen his execution grew into men and women who would one day demand their freedom. And outside Libya, his name spread. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Mecca, in India. Whispers of the old man who defied an empire reached ears hungry for hope. He became a symbol not only of Libyan resistance, but of the eternal struggle of the weak against the strong, of faith against tyranny. But what of Omar himself? What did his story teach beyond the battlefield? It taught that victory is not always counted in land or power. Sometimes victory is counted in how one dies, with dignity, with patience, with trust in God. Omar had lived a life of hardship, fought in deserts with little more than faith and grit, and met his end with peace. And because of that, his legacy outlasted cannons, outlasted gallows, outlasted empire. Think of it. How many generals have the world forgotten, though they commanded armies of thousands? Yet an old man with a rifle and a Qur'an, riding through the sands on a weary horse, is remembered by millions. Why? Because his struggle carried something beyond strategy. It carried meaning. And here we pause at the moral mirror. What does Omar's story ask of us today? Is it only to admire courage? Or is it to confront our own compromises? To ask ourselves, when injustice rises around us, do we stand firm or do we bow for comfort? When faith is tested, do we hold to it or do we sell it for safety? Would we, like Omar, accept chains rather than betray conscience? Or would we choose ease, hoping history never calls our name? The Italians celebrated Omar's execution as their triumph. Yet less than 20 years later, their empire collapsed. Libya, though scarred, emerged free, and Omar's name, whispered at firesides, carried in prayers, etched in hearts, became the nation's immortal banner. The gallows rotted, the empire crumbled, but the lion of the desert still roared. And so, we arrive at a haunting truth. Sometimes God writes victory not in the life of a man, but in his death. Sometimes what looks like the end to the world is in heaven's decree the true beginning. Was Omar's death a tragedy, or was it divine timing, reminding us that no empire stands forever, but faith endures? Legends often grow in silence, not through the voices of the powerful, but through the whispers of ordinary people. Omar al Mukhtar's execution had been staged as a warning, yet it became a story retold in hushed tones across deserts and mountains. His name passed from lips to ears, from fathers to sons, from mothers to daughters, until it was no longer just a man's name. It was a lesson, and that lesson was simple. One man's dignity can outlast an empire's cruelty. In Libya's villages, people clung to hope in secret. Families in the barbed wire camps, starving, grieving, broken, still found strength when Omar's story was mentioned. He faced death without fear, mothers would whisper to their children. So you must face life with courage. Imagine being a child, growing up behind fences surrounded by hunger and loss, yet hearing night after night the story of an old man who stood tall before his captors. Would that not plant in you the seed of defiance? Would it not remind you that even in chains, your soul could remain free? But Omar's memory did not stop at Libya's borders. His story traveled further, carried by pilgrims who spoke of him in Mecca, by students in Cairo, by merchants in Damascus. The Arab world, long weary under foreign control, found in him a symbol of resistance, rooted not in politics, but in faith. It was not the tale of a soldier only. It was the tale of a believer who chose God's command over worldly comfort. That difference made Omar's story transcend nations. He was not just Libya's fighter. He was every believer's reminder that injustice, no matter how powerful, cannot erase truth. In Cairo, newspapers printed accounts of his trial. Scholars spoke of him in lectures. Poets recited verses in his memory. And across the Muslim world, the story of an old Qur'an teacher who defied armies became a rallying cry. If Omar, at 70 years old, stood firm, what excuse do we, the young and strong, have? And here lies a hidden twist. Omar's greatest power was not in the battles he won, but in the way his loss inspired victories beyond his lifetime. But his story also raises uncomfortable questions. What if his people had surrendered earlier? Would thousands of lives have been spared in the camps? Was his defiance a shield or a sword that cut both his enemies and his own? These questions linger even now, and perhaps that is why Omar's life continues to haunt us. Because it does not offer easy answers. Instead, it forces us to wrestle with faith, morality, and sacrifice. When is resistance noble? When is surrender wise? And when does God call us not to win, but to witness? In 1943, more than a decade after his death, Libya fell into British hands during World War II. By 1951, the nation declared independence. And at that moment, whose memory rose to the surface? Not the generals who commanded armies, not the politicians who signed papers, but Omar al Mukhtar, the old man who walked calmly to the gallows. It was as if his spirit had been waiting for that hour, whispering through history, empires fade, faith remains. Even today, Omar's story stretches beyond Libya. In the 1980s, the film Lion of the Desert brought his struggle to global audiences. People who had never heard of Libya before wept watching the tale of an old man facing impossible odds. And once again, the world was reminded. There are men whose power is not measured in thrones or crowns, but in the moral gravity of their choices. And so we sit tonight, by our fireside, nearly a century later, still speaking his name, still asking the questions his life raises, still feeling the weight of his gaze from that courtroom, from that gallows. If you had been in his place, 73 years old, with the chance to lay down your arms and live the rest of your days in peace, would you have taken it? Or would you have stood firm, knowing your decision might cost countless lives, but your surrender might cost a nation its soul? What would you have chosen? The Italians thought they had ended Omar al Mukhtar on September 16th, 1931. In reality, they had only begun his story. For while his body was gone, his legacy grew, nourished not by power, but by faith. And perhaps that is the ultimate reminder. God sometimes takes away the man to let the message live forever. History is not written only by victors. Sometimes it is written by martyrs. And Omar al Mukhtar's death, though meant to erase him, carved his name deeper into the soul of his people. By the time Libya declared independence in 1951, 2 decades after his execution, his image had already become more than memory. He was a compass. Politicians invoked his name in speeches, mothers whispered his courage into their children's ears, and freedom fighters across the Arab world claimed him as a proof that dignity could outlast occupation. But what exactly did Omar leave behind? Not wealth, not armies, not monuments. He left behind something far rarer, an example. He had no sons to inherit his place, no dynasty to protect his name. Yet in every Libyan heart, he had planted a seed, the belief that faith and justice are worth sacrifice. And when the colonial flags came down and a new flag was raised, it was his face, not the conquerors, that lived in the nation's conscience. Isn't it remarkable that a man who owned almost nothing, who rode a weary horse and taught Qur'an to village children, became the eternal symbol of a nation? What does that say about what truly endures in this world? The generations that came after him did not always agree on politics, but they agreed on one thing. Omar's story was untouchable. His name was spoken with reverence, his example used as a moral test. Leaders asked themselves, would Omar approve of my choices? Families asked their children, will you carry yourself with dignity as he did? It was as if his life had become a mirror in which the living measured their own courage. Yet his story was not free of tension, for while many celebrated his resistance, some still questioned, was it worth it? The camps had claimed tens of thousands of lives. The desert was littered with the bones of innocents. Could surrender have spared them? This question lingers, and perhaps it must. For Omar's life does not invite easy answers. Instead, It forces us to wrestle with faith's hardest demands. Do we endure suffering for the sake of principle, trusting in God's unseen plan? Or do we choose compromise, seeking to ease pain in the short term? It is a question that echoes not only in Omar's desert, but in our own daily lives. And beyond Libya, his story continued to ripple. In Algeria, as they fought their own war of independence against France, fighters remembered Omar. In Palestine, in Egypt, in India, in every land where people felt the weight of occupation, his name was invoked as a reminder. We are not powerless. Look at the old man of Libya who stood against armies. Even those who did not share his faith saw in him something universal, the image of a man who refused to bow to injustice, even when defeat seemed certain. But perhaps the greatest twist of all is this. Omar al Mukhtar's true victory was not military nor even political. His true victory was spiritual. The Italians thought they were hanging a rebel. In truth, they were elevating a witness to the belief that submission is for God alone, a witness to patience in the face of cruelty, a witness to the truth that sometimes, to lose everything in this life is to gain eternity in the next. And so the story lingers. What does Omar's journey teach us, gathered here by the fireside tonight? It teaches us that the measure of a man is not his comfort, but his conscience, that the truest legacy is not built in stone, but in hearts, that sometimes God calls us not to win battles, but to stand firm so others may one day win them. And it asks us questions that pierce through time. Would you have the courage to resist when the world tells you to surrender? Do we recognize God's hand when He writes victory and loss? And when our own tests come, will we choose the path of ease or the path of truth? The lion of the desert is gone, yet his roar remains. It echoes not only through Libya's dunes, but through every soul that still wonders, is dignity worth suffering for? Is faith worth dying for? And perhaps that is the secret of his story's endurance, that it does not end with him, but continues in the choices we make each day. Stories are like rivers. They flow beyond their origins, carving paths into places the storyteller never dreamed of. Omar al Mukhtar's story, born in the dusty villages of Cyrenaica, did not remain bound to Libya's soil. It flowed outward, carried by memory, poetry, film, and faith, until the world itself began to echo with the name of the Lion of the Desert. In Libya, his memory became sacred. After independence in 1951, his face appeared on stamps, coins, and later, even currency. Schools told his story as part of the national heritage. Streets, squares, and mosques carried his name. Yet more powerful than all of this was the way ordinary Libyans remembered him. Not as a distant hero, but as a fatherly figure who embodied patience, faith, and dignity. Old men would still recall how he prayed before battle. Mothers would tell their children how he treated prisoners with mercy. For Libyans, he was not a myth. He was family. Isn't it striking? Many nations forget their heroes, burying them beneath politics and division. But Libya clung to Omar, because he represented not politics, but principle. Beyond Libya, his image traveled far. In 1981, the film Lion of the Desert brought his struggle to the global stage. Anthony Quinn, playing Omar, gave flesh to the legend, while audiences across the world witnessed the story of an old man who defied tanks with faith and strategy. Though banned in Italy for decades, the film found its way into countless homes, sparking tears and admiration across continents. And here's the twist. A man who lived humbly, who never sought fame, became a cinematic icon. His resistance replayed on screens for generations who had never known his deserts. But even before Hollywood, poetry carried his spirit. Libyan poets wrote verses about his gallows, his final prayer, his steady eyes. Arab poets abroad invoked his name as a metaphor for steadfastness. And scholars pointed to his example as proof that Islam did not produce only worshippers, but also defenders of justice. In every retelling, one theme endured. Omar was not great because he fought. He was great because he refused to bow. Yet, as his story spread, it also challenged listeners in uncomfortable ways. It forced them to ask, are we willing to live as he did? To sacrifice as he did? To die as he did? It is easy to admire a hero from a distance. It is harder to measure your own life against their courage. But perhaps that is why Omar's story continues to sting. It does not allow us to remain neutral. It pulls us into the moral struggle. What would you do if you stood in his place? Libyan children of later generations grew up reciting a phrase, Omar did not die, Omar lives. In their minds, his gallows was not an end, but a door. His death not a silence, but a roar. And in that belief, they found strength to endure their own hardships. Because what Omar proved was timeless. Injustice may seem invincible, but God writes history differently. Armies may rule for decades, but faith outlives them all. But let us pause by our fireside, you and I, and draw this lesson closer. Omar's story is not only about Libya, it is about us. When we are faced with compromise, do we remember that dignity costs more but lasts longer? When we are tempted by comfort, do we see that faith often asks us to choose the harder road? When the world hangs its noose over us, whether of fear, failure, or temptation, do we step forward with peace, or do we shrink back in silence? These are questions Omar's life presses upon every listener, questions we cannot escape. The Italians believed the world would forget him. Instead, the world was reminded of him, again and again, in poetry, in film, in stories whispered across generations. His chains became a crown. His gallows became a pulpit. His death became a sermon the world could not ignore. And maybe, just maybe, that was God's plan all along. To take the life of one old man and through it, awaken the dignity of millions. So, was Omar al Mukhtar only the lion of the desert? Or was he in truth the lion of every heart that refuses to bow to injustice? Time passes, empires fall, new nations rise, and the winds of politics shift like sand in the desert. Yet some names refuse to fade. Omar al Mukhtar's is one of them. Nearly a century after his death, his story still speaks, not only to Libyans, not only to Arabs, but to anyone who has ever faced injustice and asked, should I bow or should I stand? In Libya, his face remains a constant reminder. His portrait hangs in classrooms and government buildings. His name adorns streets and schools. But, more importantly, his spirit lingers in conversations. When Libyans argue about their future, when they struggle with divisions or face hardship, someone inevitably asks, what would Omar have done? This is his true immortality, not carved in stone, but alive in conscience. But Omar's legacy stretches far beyond his homeland. Around the world, his story has become a parable for resistance rooted in dignity. In movements for independence, in struggles against oppression, his name surfaces as a quiet whisper of strength. To the oppressed, he is proof that one person's faith can outshine an empire's cruelty. To the powerful, he is a warning that no tyranny lasts forever. And perhaps that is why his memory stings even now. Because his life does not simply inspire, it convicts. For what Omar embodied was not just courage, but costly courage. He did not fight in his youth, with strength and vigor on his side. He fought as an old man, weary in body, but unyielding in soul. His resistance was not easy or clean. It brought suffering, loss, and grief. Yet still he chose it. Would we do the same? Would we, in our later years, risk comfort, safety, and peace of mind to stand for what is right? Or would we say, I have done enough. Let someone else carry this burden? It is an uncomfortable question, but that is why Omar's story endures. The world today is not short of injustice. Nations rise and fall. Wars scar the earth. People are oppressed. Voices silenced. And in the face of such darkness, Omar's story becomes a mirror, It asks, when the test comes, will we be ready? Not all of us are called to fight in deserts, but all of us are called to make choices. Choices of conscience, choices of dignity, choices of faith. When you see corruption at work, do you stay silent or speak? When someone is wronged, do you look away or stand beside them? When your faith is tested, do you bend for convenience or remain firm for truth? These are battles fought not with rifles, but with hearts. And Omar's example tells us that even in the smallest moments, resistance matters. Perhaps the greatest beauty of his legacy is that it refuses to be confined to history books. It lives whenever someone chooses principle over profit, truth over lies, God's command over man's demand. It whispers in the soul, dignity is costly, but it is never wasted. Faith may be tested, but it is never in vain. And here lies the hidden twist in Omar's tale. His life was not just about fighting Italians. His life was about teaching us that the real battleground is always the soul. Armies may conquer lands, but only we decide whether our conscience will remain free. And so, Omar's story is not finished. It continues wherever injustice rises, wherever faith is tested, wherever men and women stand at the crossroads between surrender and resistance. Tonight, as we sit by the fireside, Omar's life leans across the decades to whisper its final challenge. When your time comes, when you face your own trial, whether in public or in the quiet of your heart, will you choose comfort or will you choose dignity? Will you bow to fear or will you bow only to God? That is why Omar al Mukhtar still matters. Not because he fought, but because he chose. And in choosing, he showed us all that the greatest victory is not to live long, but to live true. There's a moment at the end of every story when we lean back and ask ourselves, what does it mean? Why does it still matter? Omar al Mukhtar's journey, from Qur'an teacher to resistance leader, from shepherd to martyr, is more than history. It is a mirror that reflects not only his deserts, his battles, his gallows, but our own choices, our own trials, our own faith. When we remember him, we see an old man who could have chosen comfort, who could have said, I have lived long enough, let others fight. But he did not. He chose to carry the burden when others laid it down. He chose to lead when others faltered. He chose dignity when surrender was easier. And in that choice, he left behind a truth that outlives armies. A single life, lived faithfully, can become the inheritance of generations. Think of it, Italy came with planes, tanks, thousands of troops. Omar came with a Qur'an and a rifle. They came with empire. He came with patience. By every earthly measure, they won. They hanged him. They silenced his voice. But where are they now? Their empire is dust, their flags forgotten. And Omar? His name still burns like fire across the world. Was that defeat, or was that the most profound victory of all? But Omar's story is not meant to remain in the past. It comes alive each time we face injustice, each time we are tempted by compromise, each time our faith is tested. Because the question is not whether we admire him. The question is whether we will follow his example. Will we stand when it costs us dearly? Will we speak truth when silence feels safer? Will we endure hardship, trusting that God is already 3 steps ahead? These are the questions his story presses upon us. And the answers will not be written in books. They will be written in how we live. At its heart, Omar's life is a story about God's unseen hand. For while men thought they were ending him, God was raising him. While the world thought the gallows was a defeat, heaven wrote it as testimony. His death did not silence his people. It gave them voice. His struggle did not vanish in sand. It carved the path for freedom. And perhaps that is why his story continues to stir hearts nearly a century later, because it whispers the truth that every believer longs to hear. that no sacrifice for God is ever wasted. Tonight, as our fire burns low, I ask you to hold Omar's story close, not as a tale of deserts and battles long gone, but as a reminder that dignity, patience, and faith are treasures no empire can steal. Because each of us, in our own way, will face our moment of choice. Maybe not with armies and gallows, but in our homes, our workplaces, our friendships, our conscience. And when that moment comes, perhaps Omar's memory will lean across time and whisper, "Do not bow to fear. Do not sell your soul for comfort. Stand firm. Submission belongs to God alone." And so, we close the circle of his life. Omar al Mukhtar, the teacher, the shepherd, the fighter, the martyr. The man who walked calmly to the gallows, leaving behind not despair, but dignity. The lion of the desert, whose roar still echoes in the silence of our hearts. Good evening, dear friends, and thank you for sitting with me by the fireside tonight. Thank you for carrying Omar's memory in your thoughts, for letting his courage inspire your own. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.